Further, this self, qua a pure self-identical knowing, is the absolute universal, so that just this knowing as its own knowing, as conviction, is duty. Duty is no longer the universal that stands over against the self. On the contrary, it is known to have no validity when thus separated. It is now the law that exists for the sake of the self, not the self that exists for the sake of the law. Law and duty, however, have for that reason the significance not only of being for self, but also of intrinsic being. For this knowing, because it is self-identical, is precisely the in itself. In consciousness, too, this in itself separates itself from that immediate unity with being for self, as thus standing over against the latter, it is being a being for another. Duty itself, as duty forsaken by the self, is now known to be only a moment. From signifying the absolute essence, it has fallen to the level of mere being, which is not self, is not for itself, and is therefore a being for another. But the being for another remains an essential moment just because the self, qua consciousness, constitutes the antithesis of being for self and being for another, and now duty is present in consciousness as something directly actual, is no longer merely abstract, pure consciousness. Here now in paragraph 639, we are seeing an important turning point in the development of the moral consciousness. And this is a development, you could say, not with grasping some absolutely new idea, but with a shift in how the moral consciousness is understanding itself in relation to the one thing it's been completely centered around, morality, or, if you like, duty, Pflicht, right? And Hegel starts this paragraph out by saying, this self, as a pure self-identical knowing, is the absolute universal, so that just this knowing as its own knowledge, as conviction, is, in fact, duty. And conviction, being convinced, Überzeugung, right? So we're talking about something here that isn't purely theoretical, but is inherently practical. This knowing is a knowing of itself as a moral being, as an agent, as something that has agency, as something that could do the right thing or do the wrong thing, but is recognizing some sort of duty. And Hegel wants to stress here that at this point, as we've seen in the previous paragraphs, the self is now being viewed as what is really universal. Before it was duty and the self was particular. Or it might be something that's not really a self, but a self projected as the universal into the beyond. Now we actually have the self grasping itself as conscience, Gewissen, right? And so what was duty, with a capital D, all capital letters, has been revealed as something that we actually projected out there and now can recuperate back into ourselves. There's this Hegelian motion of estrangement, or alienation, Entfremdung, and then a reconciliation that takes place within the Hegelian dialectic. So, the self is a pure self-identical knowing, right? Self-identical doesn't mean that it's some sort of tautology or some, navel-gazing turned in on itself. It's actually trying to figure out, where does it fit into the world, and how does the world fit into it? There's a little bit more to the story, but we're going to see this arise in the next paragraph even more. So, he says that just this knowing, as its own knowing, as conviction, as Überzeugung, is duty, Pflicht, right? Duty, he says now, is no longer the universal that stood over against the self. It's known to have no validity when separated. Okay, so when was it separated? When we found that we ourselves could not possibly live up to the duty, when we were dealing with all these paradoxes or antinomies or antitheses between happiness and morality, or the nature and our inclinations and desires, and what a whole pure, completely realized will would look like, but it couldn't be realized, it could only be ideal. All of those sorts of things, we've now moved past that. And with that, this notion of duty has been, if not simply canceled out, transcended in a way, aufgehoben, right? So at first we were considering it as absolute essence. He says, it's now the law that exists for the sake of the self, not the self that exists for the sake of the law. A very important reversal has happened here. Law and duty, he says, have for that reason the significance not only of being for self, but also of intrinsic being, that is, being in itself, an sich sein, as opposed to für sich sein. And, when we're in the Hegelian dialectic, we're always attentive to this being in itself, being for itself, and we want to put the two of them together, get something that is being in and for itself. That's always what we're aiming at. So it sounds as if law and duty, insofar as they fall within the scope of the self or conscience, right, now are able to have that sort of status. But that's not really the case. He says, law and duty have the significance not only of being for self, but also of intrinsic being. Why? For this knowing, because it is self-identical, is precisely the in itself. So the self is already the being in itself. And in a certain way, duty is being evacuated, you could say, drained of its transcendental status. Or you could say it's being brought along and put under the heading of the self, brought within its ambit. So he goes on and he says, in consciousness, this in itself separates itself from this immediate unity with being for self. So the immediate unity here is the being for self, this kind of circular relation. I know who I am because I think about myself, and I am convinced. I have, this conscience, Gewissen. I have a knowledge, a Wissen of myself, who I am. I'm aware of myself as a moral agent. I'm aware of myself as the one who recognizes duty, or could choose not to recognize duty, or exists in relation to duty, which is not something coming from some heavenly being imposed on me like some sort of stamp or cookie cutter that I'd better wiggle my way into, but rather something that I now recognize have been bringing to the world. And when we do this, when we recognize how much of a role that we ourselves play in morality, there is that temptation of saying, well, it's all up to us, the hell with it. We don't have to follow any duties. We can make of this whatever we want. Or we could, succumb to one of the early Enlightenment dreams. Well, if there's no God in heaven above, we can make earth a heaven. And oftentimes we make it a hell because of that. Hegel has, by the way, and this is a bit of an aside, a very ambivalent relationship with the Enlightenment. You can say he thinks it hasn't gone far enough. It wasn't self-conscious enough. It didn't take into account its own development. So a naive conception of Enlightenment as just leaving those stupid people of faith behind and substituting science in its wake, that's not going to cut it for somebody like Hegel. That would be a science of the understanding, but not of Vernunft, reason, or Begriff, the concept. That would be a science of the understanding which operates in terms merely of picture language. I realize we're going a little bit outside of the text here, but it's useful context, I think. So he goes on and he says, duty itself, as duty forsaken by the self, is now known only to be a moment. From signifying the absolute essence, what it was signifying before, it has fallen to the level of mere being. which is not self, is not for itself, and therefore is being for another. Being in itself, at this point in time, doesn't get you much. Instead, it's rather being for another. And the dialectic here is going to be between being for itself and being for another. So he says, the being for another remains an essential moment just because the self, as consciousness, constitutes, here it's translated as antithesis, Gegensatz, constitutes the antithesis of being for self and being for another. And now, what is duty present in consciousness as? Duty is present in consciousness as something directly actual and is no longer merely abstract self-consciousness as it was in the previous conception of duty that we were working with before. So, we have an advance being made here, and something new is going to be brought on the scene, or rather brought back to the scene, in the next paragraph. This being for another is therefore the substance which remains in itself or unexplicated, which is distinct from the self. Conscious has not given up pure duty or the abstract in itself. Duty is the essential moment of relating itself qua universality to another. Conscience is the common element of the two self-consciousnesses, and this element is the substance in which the deed has an enduring reality, the moment of being recognized and acknowledged by others. The moral consciousness does not possess this moment of recognition by others of pure consciousness which has a real existence, and consequently does not act or actualize anything at all. Its in itself is for it either abstract, unreal essence or being as a reality which is not spiritual. The existent reality of conscience, however, is one which is a self, an existence which is conscious of itself, the spiritual element of being recognized and acknowledged. The action is thus only the translation of its individual content into the objective element in which it is universal and recognized, and it is just the fact that it is recognized that makes the deed a reality. The deed is recognized and thereby made real because the existent reality is directly linked with conviction or knowledge. Or in other words, knowing one's purpose is directly the element of existence is universal recognition. For the essence of the action, duty, consists in conscience's conviction about it. It is just this conviction that is the in itself. It is the implicitly universal self-consciousness or the state of being recognized and hence a reality. What is done with the conviction of duty is, therefore, at once something that is standing and a real existence. There is then no more talk of good intentions coming to nothing or of the good man faring badly. On the contrary, the duty that is known to be such is fulfilled and becomes a reality, just because what is essentially a duty is the universal for all self-consciousness, is that which is recognized and acknowledged and thus positively is. But taken separately and alone without the content of self, duty is a being for another, something transparent which has merely the significance of an essentiality in general, lacking all content. Paragraph 640 now brings the turning point past the turning point, you could say. What was going to be a sort of pivot, this distinction between the for itself and the for another, and how self and duty are connected, brings in the other. And this is a term that we've seen is very important in Hegel. Consciousness is always related to some sort of other, but what makes consciousness, human consciousness, really what it is that it's not only related to an other as in, pieces of chalk or objects, things that we can perceive, but it's related to another consciousness, another self-consciousness. We saw this with the beginning of the self-consciousness section, going through the master-slave dialectic, stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness, the reason section, and all sorts of other parts of spirit. And once again, the other is brought into play in this long paragraph Why? Because self-consciousness, which is what human spirit really is, Geist, mind, can never truly get away from the other. And the question is, how is it going to not exist solely alienated from the other, or fused and identified with the other, or subordinated to the other, or subordinating the other, but in some sort of more productive, integrative relationship? And that is what morality and duty is in some way always on the cusp of, right? We could think of, this is a little bit of a digression before we go into this particular passage, but think of the interplay that's been going on for the most part in the previous sections of this morality portion of Spirit. It's been going back and forth in a rather individualistic way, or where the individual is the universal, right? It hasn't really engaged with other people so much. A little bit in the, self-deception or dissemblance part, I suppose you could say, but it really could just be fooling itself. Here, in this paragraph, we now have not only another consciousness coming in, another self-consciousness, we have what was really central, what it was that self-consciousness was looking for. What was the object of its hunger or desire, its begeerde? Recognition. Anerkennen. Once again, that becomes the central motif. And that's not a dance that you can do on your own, right? You can look in mirrors as much as you like, the way people do in the gym or when they're dancing by themselves. I suppose you could do it with like a video screen and you're watching yourself. Oh, this is so great. I look so wonderful. It's not the same thing as having somebody else looking at you, is it? An other who you don't control, who you might want to try to control, but whom you're looking for some sort of recognition from. So let's take a look at this. He says, the being for another is therefore the substance that remains in itself or unexplicated, which is distinct from the self. So before, we had the self is including being for self and being for another, and now there's a split that's taking place. It turns out that the being for another is something that's attaining its own sort of substance. Before, it was just sort of, an afterthought or part of a antithesis, a Gegensatz in the previous paragraph. Now it's taking on its own life. So he says, conscience has not given up pure duty or the abstract in itself. Duty is, here's a wonderful line, the essential moment of relating itself qua universality to another. What does that mean? Duty is, let's leave the universality out of it. Duty is this relating oneself to another. The duties that I have not as Robinson Crusoe all by myself on a desert island. Actually, Robinson Crusoe is not really by himself. He has all the artifacts of humanity with him. He is bringing his culture to the island. He winds up, finding hostile people and also a native person who he calls Friday, right? So Robinson Crusoe is kind of a made up, he's a fictitious example, but even as a fictitious example, he's made up. He doesn't illustrate the person totally on their own, right? He actually does exist in relations to others. He thinks that he should keep track of time, for example. Well, why the hell should he do that? Is there some duty to the self? Well, he thinks that he should, he's bound to something, and he can't quite articulate what it is. He should also put aside provisions, which makes it kind of a boring book. Well, I took these grapes and turned them into raisins, and then I did this. That's what a lot of Robinson Crusoe consists in. Why? Why should he do any of that sort of stuff? What duty is there in that? Well, there's a relation to the other, even if the other is not right there. So he says, duty is the essential moment of relating itself to another. Now notice, qua universality, qua Allgemeinheit. we are universalities as well as specific individuals, as well as individuality itself, Eigenheit. We're also universal. The fact that you're hearing me communicate to you doesn't mean that we just have a universal medium that we're using right now, the language English, for example, and all the conceptions that go along with that. English is in me. English is in you, the hearer. Or if it's being translated, within the translator, right? Who knows what will happen with these commentaries later on. Perhaps there'll be some sort of algorithm that we can put them through. And then that's other universalities being sort of collapsed into each other. So let's go on. He says, conscience, Gewissen, is the common element, notice what he says here, of the two self-consciousnesses. Now he's not just talking about self and other, he's talking about self-consciousness, another self-consciousness. You might say, well, we better watch out for this. We know where this goes off to, the master-slave dialectic, right? The two consciousnesses are going to run into each other. No, that's not going to happen. Because we are so far beyond the struggle to the death and that primitive master-slave dialectic. And this is a little bit of a digression. There's so many people that want to reduce Hegel to the master-slave dialectic. That was the key idea that he had. Nonsense. It's exactly the opposite of that. That's why it's early on in the book. And that's why people gravitate to it, because it's easy to wrap their heads around. No, the human development that has taken place means that although we can find relations that are like the master-slave dialectic, those are deviant. Those are not where the dialectic is actually developing. That's not where the initiative of world spirit developing itself through all of these people, that's not where it is or where it's going. We've advanced to a certain point. Now we have self-consciousnesses who can relate to each other in different ways. And if you remember back to the self-consciousness section, that was the great desire, was it not? Can't we have something that goes beyond this stupid play of power and gives us genuine morality, real relations to the other? Real good relations to the other, you might say. Power is real. So he says, conscience is the common element of the two self-consciousnesses. This element is the substance in which the deed has an enduring reality. The deed is the tat, right? The doing, the thing that we accomplish. It has an enduring reality. What is its enduring reality? Here's where it gets really interesting. What gives our actions genuine meaning? The meaning that we ascribe to them? Maybe if we're totally narcissistic, yes, right? But even then we want other people to oh, you're so wonderful, you matter so much, you're the best in the world, right? It's recognition by others that we want. And here, the translation can be a little bit misleading just because of the way that Miller chose to articulate it. I wrote a few of the German terms down here so we can take a look at them. He says, the deed has an enduring reality in what? The moment of being recognized and acknowledged by others. Now, the recognition and acknowledgement, lexically it sounds like they're two different things. They're the same thing. They're anerkennen, that's the verb for it. Well, the verbal form, right? The noun that's made from the verb. That means recognition, that means acknowledgement. Those are the same in this. And Hegel uses another really interesting formulation here. Anerkannt werden von den anderen, right? So by, literally from, but by the other. Being recognized, being acknowledged by the other. But notice that it's not just being, werden, right? There's this passivity to it, but there's also this sense of futurity to it in the word itself, especially when you're contrasting it against the other way that Hegel's talking here, anerkannt sein, being recognized, becoming recognized. There is a temporality that's involved here in a rather suggestive way. I don't just want to be recognized now. And I don't want my deeds just recognized now. I want them to be recognized going forward into the future. I want them to become something that will be recognized. So there's, sort of at the lexical level, there's some really interesting stuff going on here that's not being captured by the translation that I just wanted to clue you into. So he says, the moral consciousness does not possess this moment of recognition, anerkannt sein, by others of pure consciousness which has a real existence, and consequently it doesn't act. When we don't have recognition, we may engage in actions, but we don't really act because it's not being retained, it's not being recognized, it's not being acknowledged. And here, let's pause for a second. Think of the condition of so many people who are treated as non-people. And one of the ways that happens is saying, well, whatever you do, we don't care. It doesn't matter. You don't matter. That's the opposite of recognition. You're a non-person. You have being, mere being, but you don't have real being. You're not a Wesen, something essential, right? You're a Sein. So he goes on and he says, here we go, it's in itself is for it either abstract, unreal essence, or being as a reality which is not spiritual. And this is one of the problems we can fall into. Now, what else can we have? He says, the action is thus only the translation of the individual content into the objective element in which it is universal and recognized. This is where we would actually have recognition. Let me read that again. The action, the Handlung, is only the translation of its individual content, what it is that we bring to it, into this objective element in which it is universal. The individual becomes universal, right? This is an important transition. We're able to recognize what we're doing as not just being our action, but being an action of a certain sort, or an action that certain kinds of people do, that it has meaning to it. Just naming it by itself is already bringing a universal to our action. So he says it's universal and recognized, anerkannt, and it is just the fact that it is recognized that makes the deed, the doing, the tat, a reality, a Wirklichkeit. So he says the deed is recognized and thereby made real. Why? Because the existent reality is linked with conviction, Überzeugung, or knowledge. It's made practical in a sense that more than one self-consciousness can grasp. We could grasp it through a variety of different modes. We could grasp it through both of us saying, aha, I agree with you that this is what is being done. It could also be grasped through conflict, where we're saying, I'm doing this, and the other person's saying, no, you're not doing that, you're doing this instead. But insofar as we can actually argue with each other, we're acknowledging each other in a certain way. Right? I mean, let me actually go into another digression. There's nothing more pathetic than all of these people who are, engaging in the debate me, bro, or you're a coward sort of thing. They so badly crave recognition. In a Hegelian aspect, they are a self-consciousness that needs to be acknowledged by another self-consciousness and doesn't quite know how to get that other than getting all aggressive and trying to, say, I've got the facts on my side, or, your argument's not a good argument, or whatever it is that they're doing. They will never get what they want. This is why they're always on the make, so to speak, that way, right? All right, let's go on. So he says, the deed is recognized, made real, because the existent reality is directly linked with conviction or knowledge. Or in other words, knowing one's purpose, one's goal, is directly the element of existence, is universal recognition. Now, notice what he brings in there, universal recognition. No longer just the recognition of one self-consciousness by another, but a broader recognition where somehow in the society we'd all be recognizing each other. That's not going to actually be attained at this point, but that's something that we're aiming at, right? That's way down the line in the very end of this work. So he says, the essence of the action, duty, consists in conscience conviction about it. What is the conviction? He says it's just this conviction that is the in itself. It is the implicitly universal self-consciousness. When we have a conscience, an individual conscience, and it is telling us, this is what you need to do, this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing, we frame it in a lot of, there's a little voice inside of me talking, or it's the voice of God implanted in me, or it's the angel on my shoulder as opposed to the devil on my shoulder. Or, now the modern day Stoics have started having the sage on your shoulder, Socrates or Epictetus talking to you. However you want to frame it, it's another, and it's supposed to be universal. It's not just supposed to be a single other who could be, say, corrupted or something like that. So it's not like, in Family Guy, for example, where Peter Griffin has a Peter angel and a Peter devil, and they're both idiots like he is, right? No, it's something more universal than that. So he says, here we go. This conviction that is the in itself, it's the implicitly universal self-conscious or the state of being recognized, and hence a reality. What is done with the conviction of duty is therefore at once something that has standing and a real existence. Now, this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, as we're going to see. But this is, Hegel doing his usual shtick. Spirit advances. This sounds really good. Let's see where we're going, right? So he says, there is then no more talk of good intentions coming to nothing, right? Or of the good man faring badly. Why not? Well, because it turns out that there actually is a connection between, say, virtue or morality and happiness or doing well within this world. And the juncture is conscience. And not just your conscience, but the conscience of other people who are like, yeah, that guy's, or that person over there is actually doing the right thing. Let's treat them the way they ought to be. Let's recognize them. Let's say that they are a good person. We could frame this in all sorts of ways. It could be, let's fund their campaign. Let's, put them in the newspaper. Let's give them an award. Let's actually pitch in and help out with their project. But there's some sort of recognition here. And that makes it possible for the action, the moral action, to become a genuine reality. Something that wasn't happening before. So he says, the duty that is known to be such is fulfilled, brought to fruition, and becomes a reality. Just because what is essentially a duty is the universal for who? For me? No, for all self-consciousness, as Hegel says. In actually recognizing how I ought to behave, and this is admittedly quite ideal, I'm setting down a pattern for all self-consciousnesses. Isn't that wonderful? So he goes on and he says, this is what is recognized and acknowledged and thus positively is. Notice, to be recognized is to have being, to be given more being. Why? Because we're social creatures. Because what we say, not just what we do, actually matters. And what other people think and say and believe also matters. This, of course, makes us vulnerable to our own foolishness or to their own jackassery in getting things wrong. There's no guarantee that they're actually going to embody universal self-consciousness particularly well or morality. You can behave as a moral agent and have a whole bunch of people around you who say, oh, why'd you do that? That doesn't pay off well. You're stupid. Or all sorts of things along those lines, and we see many examples of that. So he goes on and he says, taken separately and alone, without the content of self, duty is a being for another, something transparent, which has merely the significance of an essentiality in general, lacking all content. If we want duty to make sense at this point, it has to be the duty of people who exist in relation to each other and who give each other recognition or acknowledgement.